You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast.
Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Common Descent Podcast. This is episode 187. Our topic this episode is migration.
Woo!
We will be discussing the ins and outs of migration. We'll talk about what it means, what makes it unique. We'll have some fun exploring some of our favorite and most exciting examples of migration, what it means for ecology and evolution, and we'll talk about how we identify it in the fossil record.
Let's take a trip through migration.
It's gonna be a long journey all the way to the end of the episode. This is a very cool topic. I was very excited to get to dive into it. Sometimes there's an episode topic and you just know from the start that you're gonna get to look up a bunch of cool examples of a thing. In this case, both in the modern world and in the fossil record. Very cool stuff. Migration as an episode topic was also requested by a whole bunch of people. Here's who those people are. Tom, Jackie, Mad Jack Hyphen, Susan, Drew, Jesse, Aaron, Z, Gemfire, Greenie, Stacy, and Matthew.
Excellent taste, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. This is a popular request topic. The migration discussion happens after the break, which is after the news, which is after these announcements. First and foremost, we have a Patreon. The support that we receive from our patrons on Patreon allows us to do all the podcast stuff. We are always very grateful to our patrons. We like to shout them out here at the top of the episode. Patrons get a whole bunch of goodies for supporting us, including bonus content, live streams, fun things like that. One of the rewards you can get as a patron is your name shouted out at the top of an episode when you join that tier. This episode, we would like to welcome new patrons, Manrock and Trevor.
Welcome and thank you for your support.
Welcome and thank you for your support indeed. It's an exciting time for the podcast. We've got a bunch of cool stuff going on. Listeners, if you would like to support us, our science communication endeavors, please consider joining us on Patreon. You get a bunch of cool stuff that way. There are, in fact, lots of different ways that you can support us and engage with us. We're on the social medias. We have a Discord server. Hop down to the episode description and find more information about that. Also, we have a physical mailing address where people can send us goodies, like goodies we can hold and touch. We just recently got gifts from Elizabeth, a lovely little card, some crock that Will is very excited about.
It's this little chubby, cute bronze crock magnet, and it's adorable.
And a couple of nice refrigerator magnets that are snake-themed, which is very fun.
Yeah, we got neat magnets.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Happy spring to you and to everybody.
Thank you.
Our big announcement for the year is we have a new series that's going on, Spotlight 2024, an interview series where we are, all throughout the year, sitting down with our fellow paleontology podcasters and sci-commers to talk about science communication. The series has begun releasing. By the time you're hearing this, the first episode of Spotlight 2024 has been released, where we sat down for a chat with Adele Pentland, the host and creator of Pals and Paleo, for a wonderful discussion where we talked about podcasting and museum stuff and science communication. It was a lot of fun.
It's been tons of fun, so check that out if you're eager for the behind-the-scenes of podcasting discussions.
We've recorded a bunch of these interviews. They have been a lot of fun to put together. We will be releasing Spotlight 2024 episodes on the first Wednesday of each month, moving forward until we run out of episodes.
Yeah, we no longer have friends to talk to.
Until we're out, and we've talked to all of them. Go check out that episode. Go check out Adele's podcast. And a big thanks to Adele for being our first guest and getting the series started on a lovely high note.
Absolutely.
Also, at the end of this month, March, not long after this episode comes out, we will be at ETS Yukon in Johnson City, Tennessee.
Yeah.
Where we'll do a few presentations about nerdy stuff and fossil-y stuff.
We got some fun ones planned. I'm excited for this year.
This is going to be good. This will be a fun one. This will be our biggest year yet, technically speaking, although, keep it simple and fun. And with that, we're done announcing our new things, so let's move on to announcing other people's new things in the news section. Every episode, we like to pick some news from paleontology and related scientists. Keeps us all up to date. Starting with whatever Will has.
I have news about a crab with a big meaty claw.
I thought those are the best kinds of crabs.
In fact,
It's my favorite part.
biggest meaty claw we've found in the fossil
The biggest,
record.
meatiest claw?
Yes. This is research by Barry von Backel and Alex Oso in the New Zealand Journal of Geology and Geophysics. And the article is by Murgakshi Dixit in Interesting Engineering. This is describing, it's not like multiple specimens, but a new species of fossil crab that was found in Miocene deposits, and it's approximately 8.8 million years old, from North Island in New Zealand. The new species has been nicknamed the Southern Giant Crab, because it's a big crab.
Cool. From the south.
Yep.
Well, the Northern Island, but,
Yeah. Northern Island in the Southern Hemisphere.
South of most of everything else.
Which has been given the scientific name Pseudocarcinus carlraubenheimeri. This is a well-preserved specimen with articulated parts, so in crab shape still. The article said that the carapace, one article I found said the carapace measured 8 inches across.
Ooh.
So decent-sized crab.
Decent-sized crab.
Its claw, the bigger of the two claws, it had one really big one, it seemed, is the largest fossilized crab claw yet found.
Ooh.
And is 15 centimeters long, 6-inch long claw.
Wow.
This is a big claw.
That's a big crab claw.
Yeah, so this is a big, beefy crab with a big, meaty claw. It was found in sediments that were partially made out of reworked volcanogenic material. So volcanic.
Ash and stuff.
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
From volcanic activity in the surrounding islands. And it is the first evidence of this kind of crab, the pseudocarcinus crabs, that they inhabited the New Zealand area.
Oh, cool.
Mm-hmm. There are members of this group still alive today. Pseudocarius gigas is the Tasmanian giant crab and is currently one of the largest crabs. I think it's like the second heaviest next to the Japanese spider crab.
All right, so this is a long-standing tradition for these crabs.
And it does have a bigger claw. Theirs can get up to 47 centimeters long, according to one report I found.
Whoa.
That this is a crab that can have a foot-long claw, if not more.
Whew.
So
this is the largest fossil example.
Largest fossil claw we found. Not largest claw known. But it could mean that this fossil species might be a precursor, like you said, setting the precedent for this group of gigantism, and might shed some more light on the evolution of these features of this group. This group is known to get big in general, and these seem to have survived in both sides of the Tasman Sea, typically being deep water carnivorous crabs, using that large claw to hunt. This area that this crab was found in was characterized by that volcanic material. There is seemingly a series of volcanoes that went off in what's known as the Mohakatino Volcanic Center, which erupted and led to a paleo environment that seems to have been ideal for these crabs. They said it offered favorable conditions for their food sources and calcium carbonate supply for their shell.
Makes sense.
So it seems to have made an ideal environment for these crabs. They also noted in the abstract that these being deeper dwelling crabs, probably going after things like gastropods, snails and stuff, and bivalves, there seems to have been an advance in claw engineering with increased molluscivorous crabs, so things eating these shelled animals in the late Cretaceous and into this time period.
Makes sense. If you're going to eat something that has a hard shell, having a big heavy claw would be handy.
And so this one seems to line up with that, or at least fall into a pattern that was already known. I'm not sure which it was for the study, but big, powerful crab.
A big, powerful crab that was cracking open shells and living in the shadows of volcanoes.
It's a cool crab.
That was a pretty cool crab. Something, weak point for massive damage. I've got a news about an ancient forest. Perhaps the most ancient forest.
Ooh.
This is pretty cool. This is research by Neil Davies et al. In the Journal of the Geological Society, and we'll link in the blog post to an article on Live Science by Sasha Pear. These researchers describe the fossil remains of a forest from the Hangman Sandstone Formation in England, specifically in Somerset and Devon. This is a formation that dates back to the Devonian around 390 million years ago, around the time that plants as we think of them are really starting to get a foothold, take root, as it were. They note in the paper that this rock formation has previously been considered not good for finding fossil plants.
Oh, okay.
Here, they found lots of fossil plants. They have uncovered the remains of what appears to be a forest from this deposit. They found abundant fossils of trees, mostly, it sounds like, logs, bits of debris, things like that, all belonging to a group of trees called cladoxylopsids, which they said look like palms, kind of, but are absolutely not palms.
Yep.
They're thought to be relatives of ferns and horsetails. They have a long stem-like trunk with fronds coming off the top that look like palm fronds, but they noted they're not actually leaves. They're twigs. They're like clusters of twigs, it sounds like.
Weird.
So weird, ancient, almost 400-million-year-old trees. They noted that these trees would have stood probably 2 to 4 meters tall, so 6 to 13 feet or so not particularly tall trees.
No.
What really stands out is that many of these stems are preserved in position as a fossil forest. So a lot of the actual trunks of the trees are partially preserved where they sat.
That's cool.
Which means you can see that, that tree trunk, but also where they sat in relation to each other. So you can get a sense of how they were spaced, where they were occupying in this region.
Yeah, how dense this forest was.
Absolutely. Which is not at all unique to this deposit. But not only are these the earliest known fossil trees from Britain, this is also, according to the authors, the oldest example of a fossil site with those trees preserved in place like that. There are other sites like this. This is the oldest one.
Cool.
The previous record holder was a fossil forest called Gilboa Forest in New York, which is around 386 million years ago, so just 5 or so million years younger than this one. The authors note that comparing the two is really interesting because the slightly younger one in New York has a more diverse assemblage of trees. It sounds like the plants in this new one in England are mostly the same family of trees.
Okay.
Which might suggest that forests got started and then became more advanced and complex fairly quickly over the course of just a few million years. There are also arthropod tracks within the trees. There's nothing more to say about those. I didn't even notice them identifying them. If they did, it was deeper in the paper where I didn't look. But there are also arthropod tracks crawling around in there.
Bonus!
They note that this is among the earliest known forests, proper trees spaced in a dense forest. So it provides us with some evidence of what the earliest forests might have looked like. But also, the paper goes into a lot of discussion about this is also our earliest evidence of trees shaping the landscape.
Oh.
They note that the sediments in this formation include lots of rooting structures, lots of vegetation debris, places where sediment is accumulating around the trunks of plants. They note that across this formation, the sediments show evidence of low erosion rates, which is something we see in forests where the trees, all the plants rooting in are stabilizing the soil.
Yeah, holding it together.
And protect it against wind or water erosion. So not only is this some of our first glimpses at what forests on Earth looked like, but our earliest evidence of forests changing the way that landscapes work.
That's such a fun thing because it's so easy to forget that plants do that. Like, that's why they plant grass on the sides of, like, new construction hills, because otherwise it'll just wash away the next time it rains. The grass roots will hold it together. But we're so used to that it's easy to forget that wouldn't have been happening before this time.
I think we may have talked about this in episode 73 when we talked with Allie about trees. That, there was a time where the soil didn't exist the way we think of it. And when you did get loose sediments, they didn't stay in one place because there wasn't anything to hold them together. The rise of forests changed how sedimentation and erosion on earthworks.
Yes.
And here we have some of the earliest signs of that.
Very cool.
It's a cool finding.
Yeah, no, that's an amazing site. It's anytime we have preserved forest is very cool. This one's an old one, and it's got trackways, so
It's got
just
trackways.
bonus atop of bonus.
Yeah, these aren't the oldest trackways. They're not the oldest plants on land, but it is the oldest of this type of biome, of this type of habitat preserved this way.
Yes, a particularly old, particularly nice fossil site. Neat. Well, I also have the next news is about very well preserved, very old fossils. These are cephalopod fossils, so cousins of squids and octopus. These are very ancient cousins, probably some of the precursors to all the cephalopods we have now. This is a group called Plectronoceratids, and these are some newly described very good fossils. This is research by Alexander Pohl, Peter Gell, and Christian Klug in Peer J, and the article is by Evrim Yazgan in Cosmos. So, this group of cephalopods is one that includes the earliest known shelled cephalopods. These would have looked very different than a lot of the other ones you think of. Some of them probably were kind of like mini-armed snails almost, with a shell coming off the back. Like, not all of them were going to be nautilusy or even the orthocones with those long, straight cones. That many of them did have longer shells. Some were straight, some were curved. But these were usually smaller little critters than the bigger ones that came later. The bulk of material described for this group is from the late Cambrian, mostly in North China, with some in South China and areas like Siberia and Laurentia. Our knowledge of their anatomy is limited, and therefore also the taxonomy, so the grouping and who they're related to, is not entirely clear due to the nature of a lot of these specimens. Many of them are what they called longitudinal sections, so partial sections that give us a view of them, but not the entire specimen. They said this leads to misinterpretations due to variations in the plane that broke on the fossil.
Right.
You don't get the same view of every fossil because some of them broke at different points. So you get a different cross-section, basically. So you don't always have the ability to compare different species equivalently. This study describes more than 200 specimens that are not newly discovered, but are for the first time being described. These were collected by Mary Wade and their colleagues during the 1970s and 80s, but were not able to be described before Mary Wade passed away. These came from Black Mountain, or Mount Unbunmaru, in Queensland, Australia, and date to about 500 million years old. These are well preserved, so they show more of the shell and parts of the shell that we haven't really been able to get detailed looks at.
Cool.
Particularly, one of the ones that they focused on in this study is the siphuncle, which is a piece of tissue that runs along the length of their shell. These were preserved in 3 dimensions on a number of specimens, enough for them to get a good description of it for this group, describe some unique ones, and re-look at the relatedness of the different specimens that they have. Because not only is this a big collection of well-preserved, this now is more specimens than the previously published members of this group.
Right, so they've more than doubled the amount of fossils that have been analyzed for this group of animals.
Yes, so this is a massive overhaul.
Very cool.
They found a new species named Cynoaeromoceras merriwedae, named after Mary Wade.
Fitting.
This is from numerous well-preserved specimens, so they had plenty of material to work with. So much so that they were also able to look at ontogenetic trajectories, the growth patterns.
Oh yeah, from young to old.
Uh-huh.
Cool.
They gave a detailed description of the siphuncle, but I wasn't able to make heads or tails of the descriptions because I don't know the anatomy of the siphuncle.
They don't have tails.
It highly oblique segments.
All right.
Yeah. Elongated mid-dorsal portion of the septal neck.
Sure.
And laterally expanded segments that extend dorsally relative to the septal flap.
Whoa, and a siphuncle?
Yeah.
Incredible.
So They were able to give detailed descriptions of this structure, but I don't know the structure well enough to translate them for you all.
I think the takeaway here is that is an extraordinary level of preservation in this band of tissue that we normally don't get to see.
And now we have how it is unique in this group compared to other cephalopod groups.
Yes.
Like, so now we have a detailed description for this anatomy of this group of cephalopods. The complexity of the structure has caused problems in the interpretations before. This now has let them get a more overview look of the group and hopefully clear up some of those misconceptions or misinterpretations that have happened in the past, which is what they tried to do here with a revised order of this group and its families. There's a bunch that went into this. Some of these things are more technical taxonomy of, for instance, the order and the two of the families got redefined as junior synonyms for previous terms and upper taxonomic groups.
Clarifying what names go where, which names actually refer to the same things.
But to give you an idea of how much they did, they reduced the number of valid genera from 18 to 3.
Oh.
So, like, major shifts are happening.
Okay.
They accept 10 valid species, which the previously 68 have been put into. And this new grouping splits things up into what they said called distinct geographically and stratigraphically separate species. So things that they can now clearly tell are separate from a sediment layer point of view.
Yeah, it sounds like we had tons of fragmentary, incomplete remains that had been called 70 different species. And with this information, they were able to go through and say, all right, all of these are actually the same. All of these are actually the same. There's 10 species. These are from this place. These are from this time.
Yes.
Sorting it out in a much more reasonable and understood manner.
As they put it, it should better reflect the biological realities of this group.
Yes. That's very cool.
The pieces we've been looking at.
That's an overhaul of our understanding of this group of animals.
Yes. They also did emphasize, which I appreciated, that North China still remains a very important and critical area, but this new glut of information came from Australia, which is just a new area for it to come from.
Very cool. Yeah, I noticed that because the genus is Sinoaeromoceras. Sino means China.
Yep.
That when you see that prefix, because it sounds like this is already established some of this taxonomy. Here's a new place with new information.
Yeah, because like that was the only new species from this huge list of new specimens. Because most of them were already known from China, but these were in better condition than we had previously.
Well, I, as it happens, also have a bit of news about invertebrates. This is a very vertebrate-light news site. No vertebrates in this news
That's true. Yeah.
There'll be vertebrates in the main part of the episode. Don't you worry. I've got news about a pair of mating termites in amber.
Ooh, scandalous.
They thought they could hide it for 40 million years. We finally found it.
It's like when things for politicians come back from it. We're bringing this to termites. Like, what do you have to say about this?
Never going to be president now. This is research in the journal PNAS by Nobuaki Mizumoto, and we will link to a press release in phys.org via the Okinawa Institute of Science and Technology. This study focuses on a piece of amber preserved tree resin with 2 ancient termites preserved within it. According to the press release, the author found it on an e-shop, saw that it looked interesting, and purchased it so that it could be examined. The amber is Baltic amber, so it's Eocene, around 38 million years old. The authors were able to get its CT scan to get a close look at the termites and identify them as an already known species.
Cool.
Electrotermes affinis. I don't know why it's called Electrotermes. I assume there's a cool story behind that.
It's the electric type.
Notably, the 2 termites are a male and female, and the mouth parts of the female are contacting the abdomen of the male.
Oh.
Just face to rear on these 2 termites. This is interesting because we see this behavior in modern termites. There is an activity that's called tandem behavior, where 2 termites, a mating pair, male and female, one will follow the other. Mm-hmm. Usually one takes the lead, the other one will have its mouth parts or antennae contacting the butt, the abdomen end of the first one, so that they stay together while they're scouting out a nesting site. This is something we see in modern termites. The authors note this looks similar, but for one thing, fossilization can mess with the positioning of fossils. So it can be sometimes hard to tell, are we seeing them in a position that they ended up in during the fossilization process?
Yes.
And the position they're in the amber is weird. In modern termites, when they are performing this tandem behavior, it's one in front of the other. In the amber, they are side by side.
Oh, okay.
Still with the mouth parts contacting the abdomen, but they're parallel to each other instead of together in one line.
Okay.
So, in order to determine, is this just something weird that happened because of the amber, the authors did an experiment with living termites and exposed tandem termites to sticky surfaces.
Oh.
To see what happens to two termites when they're moving in tandem if they get stuck on something. And what they found is if one partner gets stuck, the other doesn't just walk away and leave. It will walk around the stuck partner and get itself stuck in trying to walk around, perhaps to investigate or whatever. And this can end up resulting in a side-by-side position like what they see in these fossil termites.
That's cool.
Which is very cool. So, well, yeah, modern termites, we can expect from this experiment, if modern termites were in tandem and got stuck in amber, in resin that later became amber, this is the position that they might very well end up in.
I like, well, and because I immediately had the idea of like, were they just doing a U-turn? You know,
right? Are you just turning around?
The front one was just turning around, and the other one hadn't caught up yet.
Which I also assumed that could be true.
But I like that there was an alternative. That's very interesting. That there was a different scenario. It's not that they did a U-turn. The other one the back one kept going and came up alongside.
Yeah, they got stuck. And this, they point out, is really important because it is a step towards understanding the taphonomy of amber fossils.
Yes.
Like, amber doesn't just capture an animal instantly and freeze it in place. There is a process here that they're a step further in understanding. They point out that this means that this does in fact appear to be the direct evidence of mating behavior in these termites, but also it shows us how termites react to this particular kind of situation, which the authors note is interesting because of how it differs from other situations.
Mm-hmm.
Other research apparently has found that if two termites are moving in tandem and a predator shows up, they'll split up and run away.
Gotcha.
But that doesn't seem to be what happens if they get stuck. They also point out that not all insects react this way. Ants, for example, are known to have certain behaviors to deal with sticky substances.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
According to the paper, apparently fire ants are known to place soil onto sticky surfaces so that they can get over it.
Yes.
And there are ants that are able to remove spider web from each other to like get the sticky spider web off of each other. So this is a description of these fossil termites and what they were doing, but it is also helping us to understand how do insects react in different situations and how can that help us to understand when they end up in something like amber. Would certain species like of ants be less likely to be preserved in amber if they have behaviors to deal with it? Are termites more prone to getting stuck in a situation like that? This is getting at some of those cool questions.
Well, because that can help us with, are we less likely or more likely to find certain members in the amber?
Mm-hmm.
And is that why we haven't found as many? Or have we found a surprising amount based off of the modern behavior? So were they not doing that yet? That's very cool.
Very cool. So a cool fossil discovery, a little bit of experimentation, and taphonomy.
Yeah.
A taphonomic experiment. Taphonomy, of course, listeners, being the study of how things become fossilized.
Mm-hmm.
A taphonomic study with insects, which I'm very familiar with taphonomic studies with vertebrate animals, not as much with insects, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah. Well, it's always neat when you can do one-to-one experiments with living members of like, all right, it looks like this might be what's happening. Let's just get the modern ones to do that.
Yes.
And see if it looks similar.
Yep.
There's something very satisfying when that can happen.
Yes.
Cool.
That's the news. Head over to the blog post on our website if you want to follow those links and learn more about those studies. But now we're going to take a short break and then return for our main discussion, where we will talk about the opposite of animals getting stuck in one place. Animals traveling long distances. We will discuss migration, beginning with the important questions of what we're talking about.
Yes.
Will, when I say migration, what comes to mind?
I think birds migrating comes to mind first. The birds moving, at least here in North America, typically north and south from winter to fall to spring.
Yeah, I think for me, the first maybe two examples that come to mind. One is birds, and the other is the Serengeti.
Yeah.
Migrations of large mammals across the area. Migrations of this kind are a very famous and very common attribute of animal life here on planet Earth. There are tons of famous migrations like that. I'm sure many of our listeners think of additional examples when we say the word migration. That's what we're going to be talking about in this episode, this habit of individuals or populations of animals taking these regular long-distance trips from one place to another. However, before we can get into the details of that thing, and part of the reason why I asked you what comes to mind is because the word migration is used in a variety of contexts.
Yeah.
So before we get to the sciencey details, let's have some fun with terminology. The word migration comes up in a ton of different scientific contexts. There's cell migration and gene migration. There's migration reactions are a thing in chemistry. Apparently IT, information tech, has a bunch of migration terms. While I was looking this up, I learned about piercing migration.
Oh, that makes sense.
Which is like ear piercings and stuff will move through the tissue over time.
Yeah, as your body tries to heal or manage that.
Migration is a word in the English language that refers to lots of things.
Yes.
We are particularly talking about the movement of organisms across environments and habitats. And even in that context, the word migration is used to refer to a bunch of things. I want to highlight 3 major ways that the word migration is used, 2 of which we will not be talking about in this episode, but I want to get them out of the way and distinguish. The first way is what we were just referring to. Right? Birds flying south for the winter, wildebeest migrating across the Serengeti, things like that. Large-scale movements of animals in and out of particular habitats. The other way that you will hear migration used quite a bit, we have used it this way quite a bit on the podcast. Migration is also used to refer to the movement of species into a new range.
Yes.
When we hear about, in paleontology, we talk about this a lot. So yes, these 2 continents became connected and it allowed species to migrate across the land bridge into this new area. Climate change is allowing animals like armadillos to migrate farther and farther north. This usage has always bugged me, personally, even though I've used it on the podcast, because that's a very different thing than the classic idea of the back and forth movement of migrating species. This is a range expansion.
Yes.
This is dispersal.
And sometimes it might be a range adjustment where like your whole range is moving north or south.
Right. And sometimes it's changing now the range is bigger than it was before or smaller than it was before. And I think that's kind of it's always kind of confused me. And I've seen it come up when we talk about migration. When we talk about the land bridge across Beringia that connects North America and Asia, when we say animals migrated across that bridge, it makes it sound like it's destination oriented.
Yes.
Well, they were taking a trip, they were headed for Canada, and they made it across Alaska and got there, where really they were living across that whole area. So this version of migration means expansion or changing of the range of a species.
Yeah, it wasn't a convoy of them coming across a new path.
Yes. This is also where the term migration is used for plants.
Yep.
Because you will hear about plant migration, or even things like forest migration,
Cool.
which is the movement of plants or forests over time. Obviously, the plants aren't moving, but they are having young, and that the distribution of the species changes over time. We can refer to this as dispersal. I like to call this dispersal. In a lot of literature, the words migration and dispersal are actually used interchangeably. So the word migration is used kind of variously. This concept of dispersal and range changing, we will not be discussing in this episode of the podcast. For the most part, get that right out of the way.
That can be a whole nother topic.
A whole other episode. Put in your request now for an episode about dispersal and such. The other way that migration is used to refer to the movement of organisms from place to place is in the concept of immigration.
Yes.
Which is used for people. People moving from country to country specifically is immigration or emigration. People will be referred to as migrants.
Migrants.
Who have moved. You used to live in one country and you've moved to another country. Literature about animal migration also refers to animal species variously as migrants who are moving back and forth. This is also not what we're talking about, the movement of people between countries in this episode, and I wanted to get that out of the way, partially because this is not the kind of migration we're talking about in this episode, although it will come up again in a fun little way a little bit later on. But generally speaking, I want to mention that because, number one, being clear about what we're talking about, but also, number two, it's always very helpful whenever we're using terms that are also used in a somewhat similar context to refer to humans, to make it clear that the things we are saying in this episode apply to wildlife and not to people.
Yes.
This is a different discussion. That's a different podcast.
Yep.
So, in this episode, we are specifically talking about these migratory patterns that we see in animals in the world, and even within that context, the definition of what counts as migration varies depending on the paper you read and the context that it's in. There have been some scientists in the past who have suggested that the migration refers to simply any movement of animals.
Yeah.
Or indeed any movement of organisms at all, which I would put forward is not particularly useful.
Yeah, that doesn't help.
Then we need a different word for this phenomenon.
Yeah, exactly.
Typically, definitions of migration attempt to distinguish this pattern of behavior from typical movements of animals. Animals are moving all the time.
Yeah.
They move to find food, to find shelter, to patrol a territory, to avoid predators. Reptiles, for example, very famously will move to regulate their body temperature. These are quote-unquote normal movements, as opposed to the particular heading to a new destination type of migration we're talking about. But it gets confusing because some animals have quote-unquote normal movements that aren't like in just one little space.
Yep.
Sometimes their normal movement does take them to a new area that they wouldn't normally be. And then there are some animals, like certain seabirds, for example, that will forage, and it's just, I'm going on a hunting trip for hundreds of kilometers.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then come back to the nest.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not really a migration in the way that, like, birds flying south for the winter is, but it sure seems to be extreme for a regular pattern of movement. So already we've got blurry edges. There are a number of features that various authors have proposed to distinguish migration from non-migratory movements, including that they tend to be a bigger deal than day-to-day movements in terms of distance, but also how long it takes.
Mm-hmm.
It could be days or weeks. Often migratory movements are cyclical.
Yes.
They are back and forth movements between different areas.
That's probably the first thing I think of.
Mm-hmm. They are also, and I thought this was an interesting point, migrating animals tend to be, as one paper put it, persistent and undistracted.
Oh, yeah.
That if you think of an animal just sort of wandering around, if they find food or shelter or water or something, they'll stop.
Yes, yeah.
Migrating animals tend not to do that. They are on a mission. They are heading to a place. They're not stopping very often. Migrating animals are noted to often pass up places where there could be food, or there could be even like places to stop and reproduce. Because there is a place they are heading to, they will ignore other stuff along the way.
That's a really good point.
Now, none of those definitions is perfect. If we sat here and went through every example of migration and movement, we would find probably exceptions to all of those. But that's generally the kind of thing that we're looking at. One of the reasons why migration is so difficult to define, besides the fact that there's a bunch of overlap with other ways that animals move, is because migration is extraordinarily diverse and variable.
A ton of animals do it, and they do it in crazy ways.
Basically, every major group of animals in the world today has some form of migration. As a baseline example, we might consider some of the classic examples of migration. Like you mentioned, a lot of birds, especially, for example, up here in the northern hemisphere where we are, will migrate north for the summer and south for the winter between seasonal places. There are a number of fish and whales that are known to migrate across oceans. Wildebeest in the Serengeti, along with other animals, migrate sort of in a big circle around that section of the African continent, sort of following the abundance of grasses and stuff. These are kind of the classic images of migration, but keeping these in mind, there is a huge amount of variation in most aspects of migratory behavior. So, let's talk about a bunch of the ways that migrations can vary, and along the way, this will be an excuse for us to bring up some of the coolest examples of migrations. One of the most important things to start with is the reasons that animals migrate. There are, the two big ones are food and breeding.
Yes.
This tends to be what gets pointed at most immediately. Migratory animals tend to be the ones that live in environments with regularly changing conditions. So if you live in an area where food is plentiful only one time of the year, if you live up in the Arctic, where there's lots of food in the summertime, but then when winter sets in, the food all disappears, it's beneficial for those animals to move away. We see this same sort of shifting with wet and dry seasons, anywhere where conditions are variable. So you might have to move to get more food. A lot of animals will migrate to one place to have and raise young, and then migrate back to the other place where it's better for the young to grow up.
Yes.
So an area might be more beneficial for protecting and caring for young, and then another area is better to be an adult growing animal. Lots of species will live in one place but travel somewhere else to do their reproductive habits. There's a bunch of other secondary benefits to migration. Migration can be a good way to avoid predators.
Yes.
That ties nicely in with the breeding aspect. If you can migrate to a place where there aren't as many predators, that's a better place to have your babies. Also, other threats. If you live in an Arctic ecosystem, not only does the food tend to go away in the wintertime, but also it's just really difficult to survive in the winter way up north.
Real cold.
Or way down south. Same thing with a dry and wet season. When it gets very dry, that might just be very harsh conditions. So it's beneficial to leave, not only to keep getting food, but also just to not die to the elements of that area.
Yeah.
Because of that aspect, the food and the changing sort of harsh conditions, migration is often brought up in the context of being sort of an alternative to hibernating. These are kind of the two things that we think about way up in the north or way down south. The bears hibernate and the birds migrate.
Yes.
That's not how they all do it. But it is one of the ways to make it through the harsh conditions of for example, winter season.
Yeah, you either have to figure out how to weather the weather.
Yeah, to overwinter, for example.
Or avoid it.
Yes, like get up and go somewhere else.
And even if it's not hibernation, those are really your only options for. You either need to be able to put up with it or get out of its way.
Or move. Yes. Another way that migrations vary widely is in their distance.
Yeah.
There are many migrations that are fairly short, that are trips of kilometers or tens of kilometers, which is a fairly short trip compared to others. Some migrations are truly mind-bogglingly enormous.
Yep.
Just to list a few of the really record-breaking famous examples, migrations can happen across any medium. There are walkers, swimmers, flyers. There's also drifting migrations that drift on currents. On land, the migration that is often cited as the longest land migration in the modern world is performed by caribou.
That's what I thought.
Yep. Caribou raise their young in Arctic habitats and then migrate to the range where they spend the winter. Multiple populations have been observed to make one-way, so from point A to point B, trips of over 1,200 kilometers, or 700 miles. You'll often see the number cited of 5,000 kilometers, which I believe, if I remember what I read correctly, comes from a study of one caribou's full yearly movement.
Gotcha.
So across the whole year, moved the equivalent of New York to Los Angeles. A very far walking caribou. In the water, there's a number of famous examples in the water. To name one, humpback whales do a similar kind of north-south thing. They spend the winter in warm waters and the summer in cooler northern waters. They're known to travel over 8,000 kilometers each way. That is a 5,000-mile trip. They will travel for days without stopping.
Yep.
To travel between these places. I also want to note that I came across one 2018 study that tracked a whale shark traveling from Panama to the Philippines across the ocean, a trip of about 20,000 kilometers, 12,000 miles.
Wow.
Full across the ocean.
Wow.
The probably winners of this competition by the metric. Do you know what animals I'm about to bring up?
I can't remember the name specifically, but I'm pretty sure I do know.
These are Arctic terns.
Yep.
And
as I said, I don't remember the name. I went, are they Arctic terns?
They are Arctic terns.
Yep.
Absolutely. Arctic terns. So these are birds. This is a flying migration. Arctic terns breed high up in the Arctic, and then when winter starts to draw near, they go on a migration to the Antarctic.
Yep.
Arctic terns migrate across the world.
About as far as you can go on a sphere.
This is what as much as you could do. Arctic terns are known to migrate around 40,000 kilometers over the course of a year. They make this back and forth trip each year. That's about 25,000 miles. There have been some studies that have tracked individual birds making total flight distance. So that is the back and forth, but also includes sort of meandering paths. These aren't always a straight line. Of yearly travel of up to 80,000 kilometers, 50,000 miles. This is a really fascinating one because it means that an Arctic tern who's doing it right never experiences winter.
Yeah.
They spend the summer up north, and then when the summer disappears, they say, well, it's summer somewhere, and then they fly across hemispheres to have a summer again.
Yeah. It's so intense. And I also love the comparison of the from land to sea to air. The distance is just getting, because it's like, yeah, well, you went from a situation where you have to deal with hills and valleys and rivers and terrain. And then you took away the terrain and made it just water. And then you went into another fluid, which was air.
Yes.
Which has even less resistance.
Which is the easiest to travel through. You move the fastest. Until some species discovers habitable environments on the moon.
Yep.
This is the biggest, by pure distance, migration around. These are just some examples. There are tons of incredible migrations. There are more to discuss. Some migrations occur in massive groups, mass migrations. A lot of bird migrations are like that. Whales will travel often in their pods. There are also animals that migrate solo. Whale sharks, I think, are like the whale shark example. I don't think that whale sharks are traveling in groups.
Yeah.
I think that's more of a one at a time. Great white sharks are an example. They do migrate. They go on long trips, but they're not traveling in groups. There was one paper that I read that was talking specifically about bird migrations that said some bird migrations are basically invisible because the birds travel alone at night.
Yeah.
Whereas others are spectacles.
Yeah, giant flocks of honking geese.
Darken the skies, like they used to say about passenger pigeons.
Well, and it's so interesting that it can vary within groups so much, because like whale sharks and great whites aren't known for it, but like hammerheads are famous for being in giant groups.
Yeah. And birds. Some birds flock in massive groups and some go solo.
So it's very interesting that it's not like a type of animal by type of animal. It's very, very different across.
Yes. Some migrations also are one long trip, and others have a bunch of stops. Birds are well known for doing this, where the migration isn't just point A to point B. There's a bunch of stops along the way. And this can be important, especially for migrations that take days to weeks.
Yeah, that would kill you if you did it in one
you
trip.
have to stop, you have to sleep, you have to eat something, even if you're not filling up fully. Migrations also, a common feature of migrations is moving between habitats. And sometimes that can be, forest to grassland or cold forest to warm forest or whatever. But sometimes it is distinct different environments. For example, there are lots of animals that migrate from the sea to the shore.
Yeah.
As part of their migration. Horseshoe crabs do this. Sea turtles do this. Sea turtles live out in the ocean, and then when it's time to lay eggs, they migrate onto the shore to lay their eggs. There are also animals that come from the opposite direction that migrate land to shore. Maybe the most famous example of this is the Christmas Island crabs.
Yeah.
Which we're not going to talk about in detail, which is a real shame. Google the Christmas Island crabs. These are crabs on Christmas Island, which is in, Indonesia, maybe? The Philippines?
Sounds
somewhere in
right.
there. My apologies to the denizens of Christmas Island. These are crabs that live in the forest, and then during the monsoon season, I believe, they make a week-long trip, just scuttling by the thousands and millions across the island to the shore.
Yep. And drop their eggs off, and then head back.
And then go back. It's this mass movement of land crabs, which is fascinating. There's all these cool, documentary footage.
Oh, yeah.
Of, the streets, because people live there.
Yeah.
Of the streets of the island just swarming with these little red crabs.
And then after, the babies have to make their trip to the forest when they hatch and grow up enough.
Yep, like sea turtles.
Yes.
It's now you are a baby sea turtle and you got to move. Now you've got to make your way back to the sea.
It's very cool.
There are also animals that are diadromous, which is a term that some of our listeners may be familiar with, which means they migrate between seawater and freshwater.
Yes.
There are two, I think, top famous examples of this. There are many species of eels that live in rivers, but for spawning, for having young, they migrate to the sea and then come back. And then the opposite direction is a path performed by salmon.
Yes.
Which is for sure one of the most famous migrations in the world.
Yeah.
I guarantee some people at the top of this discussion when I said what comes to mind when you think migration. Salmons are famous. Salmons live in the sea, but they spawn in rivers. There are populations of salmon who will migrate upriver hundreds of miles. One paper I saw cited up to 400 kilometers or 250 miles up a river.
Yeah.
Against the current, which is really something.
Yeah, against the current in a medium that you are not actually super, super happy in.
Yeah.
They can do it, but it's not good for them to just live there. They slowly are dying.
And there's tons of waterfalls. They will jump up waterfalls. It's a truly...
Bears.
There's bears. There's a lot that goes into that. There are also migrations that take place vertically.
Yes.
There are some altitude migrations, I believe, animals that will migrate up and down elevation.
Oh, that makes sense.
But the most famous example of vertical migrations happens in the ocean. There are animals like certain crustaceans that will spend winter in the depths and then come up to the surface to feed and reproduce in the warmer times.
Yeah.
And there's also, and this is an interesting, this is one of those odd sort of blurry examples. There are enormous populations of zooplankton that spend the night at the surface and the daytime deeper below the water.
Yep.
In the daytime, when all the predators are active, they hide down in the depths. And then at night, they come up to the surface to feed on phytoplankton and stuff. These daily movements can move them thousands of feet.
Yeah, they're massive. Like,
and these are microscopic organisms. That is quite a movement for these animals.
Like, the ocean's very deep, and they are moving that length on a daily.
Yeah, and this is a weird one because this is a cyclical back and forth movement between distinct habitats, but it is a daily activity.
Yep.
And so I have seen this referred to both as a migration and as just a regular day-to-day act, as non-migratory because it's sort of daily movement.
Yes.
I've seen it called commuting.
Oh, yeah.
Which is also what the seabird foraging would be considered.
That makes sense.
You're not migrating, but you do have to go over there to get some food and then come back.
Yeah, for work.
For work, yeah, you have to go over there for work. It's a commute. These are animals that need our podcast.
Yes, exactly.
So that they could listen to it while they're traveling.
That's so funny.
There are lots of species who migrate once, and then there are some species that migrate many times. So birds who do the north-south flight, for example, will migrate every year.
Yep.
For as long as they live, that could be, 10, 20 migrations. There are some animals that do one migration. Salmon are an example of this.
Yep.
Salmon are born in rivers. They swim down to the sea. They live their life out there. And then when it's time to reproduce, they swim back up the river, lay their eggs, and die there.
Yep.
A salmon's life is one round trip migration. There are a bunch of animals that do this, especially ones that breed just the one time in that spawning zone. There are also a number of species who only migrate partway during their lifetime. That a full migration is multiple generations of a species. This shows up in insects, who we haven't mentioned yet, and it's not because we've been leaving them out. Insects make some of the most spectacular migrations on the planet. I will give examples from two groups. Probably the most famous insect migration, and Will is nodding his head. Will?
Monarch butterflies.
Monarch butterflies.
Yep.
Monarch butterflies, especially populations that live in northern parts of North America, will migrate from Canada to Mexico.
That's so intense.
That is over 4,000 kilometers.
You are so tiny.
3,000 miles for butterflies.
So tiny.
And this is a mass migration.
Yeah.
There's tons of them moving across.
This is where you get those images of the trees just blanketed in butterflies.
This is a multi-generational migration. So it's very easy to think, wow, 3,000 miles is a long way for a butterfly to fly. And that is true, and they don't.
Mm-hmm.
They stop at multiple parts along the way, lay eggs, those eggs hatch, little babies come out, metamorphose into butterflies, and then keep going.
Which is so weird.
Along the migration path.
That's such a weird, generational memory type thing going on.
Well, and that's why this gets studied so often, is to answer the question, how do you know
which direction you're
supposed to go? How do you know where to go?
Yeah. How do you know what step you're on when you just got born a little while ago?
Yes.
That's so weird.
The other group of insects, to do a little callback to a few episodes ago, that do things like this, are dragonflies.
Yeah.
We mentioned this in the dragonflies episode, 181. Green darners in the United States have been observed to a generation will be born in the southern parts of the U.S. and in the spring migrate up to the northeast, have babies. When those babies grow up into full adults, they migrate back down south in the autumn. The generation that is born in the winter is non-migratory.
Yeah.
They stay there for the winter, and then their next generation migrates up north again in the spring.
That's so...
So it's a loop.
You do make a full loop.
Across 3 generations of dragonflies.
Which, makes sense on one hand of, that's a big trip for a single little bug to make in its single life. But then it makes very little sense when you think of it that for most animals that we think of doing those kinds of migrations, it's to avoid a season or to take advantage of a season. The food grows in summer and it grows best here, so I need to go there. Or the food stopped growing in winter, so I need to leave here.
Yeah.
So if you're not doing that in one go, What benefit are you getting from it?
You're migrating north for the benefit of the next generation.
Yeah.
And then they migrate south for the benefit of following generations.
And it's like, that's such a complicated syncing up of the cycle and staccato cycle. It's not an even cycle. That's so weird.
Yeah. Another famous dragonfly species that does something very similar are what are called globe skimmers, which are famous for their global distribution. These are very widely spread. They have a similar multi-generational migration circle across East Africa, Central Asia, and India, that the full circle covers more than 14,000 kilometers.
What?
Hence the name globe skimmers.
Yeah.
These are doing enormous migrations. And these are insects. Most insect migrations, incidentally, it's very easy to imagine. A lot of insects migrate by flying. There are insects that migrate by walking.
Yeah.
There are Mormon crickets do this. And locusts. There are locusts whose larvae will have a walking migration.
Yeah.
Which...
It's just that hopping mass.
Yeah, it's just the hopping mass, which seems like a very strange thing for insects to do. That's flying thousands of kilometers is already unbelievable enough for a bug. Walking, I don't have numbers in front of me, but walking a long distance seems fully unnecessary.
Well, and
you are a species that has you come from a group that has wings.
Yes.
Just have wings.
Well, and it's got that situation that the Crispin Island crabs have of like, surely aren't you just going to get, like, can't something just lay down in front of you with their mouth open and just scoop up?
Yeah.
Like, how are you not just decimated? And they probably are, but there's so many of them that it doesn't matter.
It's like the baby sea turtles.
Exactly.
Well, and the land crabs also has that weird feeling of like, wouldn't it be... I know that evolution's not making decisions, but wouldn't it be easier to just be in the water?
Yeah. They are such a conundrum of a crab.
At some point, you evolved this incredible tendency to move on land, but still needed to breed in the water, and that just became more and more exaggerated over time, and now you all have to take a week-long trip down to the beach every time that it's time to reproduce.
And you can't fall in because they can't breathe underwater anymore.
Yeah, no, you can't go in there.
So they have to go into the water to shake the babies out, but if they get caught in a wave, they're done.
Yes.
So
this is the inverse of the sea turtle situation.
Yes.
So yeah, you went out to sea, and that you are spectacularly adapted for living in the ocean. Unfortunately, you are a reptile.
Yes.
And you're a group of reptiles that never quite managed live birth, so that every time you need to reproduce, you got to come back. You have to come back onto land.
And you can technically get up here, but you should not stay here.
You're not supposed to be here. This is not working. Much like the crabs.
Yep.
You can get wet, but you need to mostly not.
You're like us. You need to go back. You need to get out of the water eventually.
There are many animals that are also only partly migratory. We just mentioned the dragonflies as an example of animals where some generations are migratory and others aren't. There are a number of species that are facultative migrants, which is they only migrate when they have to.
Yeah.
There are a lot of animals that have to migrate. If you don't migrate, the species is done. But there are a bunch that, if conditions get bad, they will migrate, but otherwise they are sedentary. They're resident species, as they are sometimes called. There are many species where some populations migrate,
yes,
and others don't. Caribou are an example. Lots of birds are like this. There are also some populations where only some individuals migrate. You will have a population of birds, for example, and when, winter or whatever comes around, some of the birds migrate and others stick around.
Oh, that's weird.
There are also species that have different migration habits between male and female, or between old and young individuals. So there can be a lot of variation in it's not always just this is a migratory species and this isn't. There can be a lot of differences. There's also a lot of variation within groups. Birds have been studied. I get the impression from the literature that birds are almost certainly the most studied migratory animals, along with insects and probably fish, especially salmon. We eat those, so that's important for us.
Yep.
There are a bunch of bird genera where some species are migratory and some species aren't. Their closest relatives will be a sedentary species. Sometimes it will vary by the population within a species. As I mentioned before, an example, again, with birds. House finches are resident birds in western North America. They don't migrate, but they were introduced to eastern North America in the mid-90s, and the eastern population became migratory.
Cool.
We moved the birds to a new place, and they started migrating as they adapted to that new place.
That is the opposite direction of what I was picturing in my head. Of
Right?
like, yeah, sure, if you're a migratory species, but then you finally find a habitat that is perfect all year round, the conditions that might trigger...
Yeah, it's like becoming flightless on an island.
Exactly,
It's like,
yeah.
now there's no need for that. You can chill.
But it happening the opposite way is not what I was expecting.
Yeah.
That's very intriguing.
One of the most famous examples of this variation that I saw mentioned in multiple papers are Eurasian blackcaps. This is a species of bird. Some populations are long-distance migrants. Some populations are short-distance migrants. Some don't migrate at all. Some populations are partially migratory. There is a spectrum of populations. The farther north you go, the more migratory they become.
Makes sense.
Across this particular species. And phylogenetic studies of these birds have suggested multiple origins of migration within this species.
Cool.
Which makes studying the evolution of migration very complicated, because it seems like it can show up not only over and over again within a group, but within a species.
Well, in that situation, I can see that being particularly confounding because it doesn't follow the logic that you might draw of like, well, if you live in an area and there is a middle zone that's perfect, would not the species just end up centering there?
Mm-hmm.
Or if that's not the case, would you not just end up migrating? And if you're migrating, wouldn't you all migrate to and from the same... Wouldn't there be two ideals? This is showing that, nope, there can be multiple ideal or at least passable situations for the species across the spectrum of a landmass.
Yes.
That means there is not a one scenario that just fits this species.
Yeah. And that really comes across in this discussion of the variability of migration. There is not one set of conditions for which migration is good.
Yep.
There are some environments where you can or you can not migrate. A lot of species, it is suggested that they migrate because you'd imagine that you look at something like, well, in the Arctic, if the food is inconsistent, why not just go live somewhere else?
Yeah.
Why even be up there in the first place? But for some species, that pulse of food availability in the Arctic is excellent, and it allows them to maintain a very large population, but then they have to go somewhere else. Mm-hmm. A lot of migratory birds, for example, will bounce between places where food is extremely plentiful sometimes, and you couldn't sustain that large population in an area that didn't do that. If you go in the middle, to hypothetically, the middle might not have enough food all year round to sustain your population. And then also on the other side, the ecosystem couldn't handle your population.
Yep. If you stayed in one spot, you might eat that environment out of being sustainable.
Yes.
It's very this just made me remember the scene from Fox and the Hound where winter's setting in and the two little birds, the woodpecker and the little songbird, go to migrate, and Big Mama the owl is getting ready to overwinter in her tree. And that was one of the first times as a kid I was introduced to the idea of like, yeah, it's not just like, yeah, birds have to migrate. Nope, there are some birds that are perfectly fine in winter and can handle it and don't have to put all that effort into migration.
Yes.
And then others that would not make it or need that benefit. Very, very neat stuff.
Another really fascinating aspect of migration that I came across and hadn't really considered academically up till now is the way that migratory animals will affect each other. There is, for example, a phenomenon of co-migration.
Yes.
Where multiple species will migrate together. On the Serengeti, the great migration of large mammals across the Serengeti, that whole section of Africa, there are multiple mammal species that will move the same path sort of side by side. There was actually a really interesting study from this year, 2024, very recently, that looked at the migratory behavior of zebras, wildebeest, and gazelles across the Great Migration, as it is often called, and found that there is an order to the migration.
Ooh.
That most of the time, zebras get to a place first, shortly before the wildebeest, and then later the gazelles show up.
Oh, cool.
And that it's probably because they are eating different foods.
Yeah.
Zebras show up to get what they can before they get crowded out by the wildebeest, which are much more numerous. Then the wildebeest eat as much as they want, and then the gazelles show up later after the bigger mammals have cleared all the really tough plants out of the way, and they can now access the high nutrition plants that might have been harder to get to before the area was cleared.
That's so cool. And it's such a weather forecasty. Because ooh, zebras are here. That means the wildebeests are going to be rolling in soon.
Yes.
That's very neat.
Migration also very famously affects predators.
Yep.
There are a number of predators that experience what is called feast and famine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
You hang out in a place and eventually a migration comes through. And now you have the opportunity to eat. One example that we have mentioned many times on the podcast is crocodiles.
Yep.
In those African environments, when the wildebeest herd has to cross a river, you can bet that's where all the crocodiles are. Sometimes crocs that haven't eaten in months.
Yeah, they may not have eaten a large mammal since the last migration.
Yes. So you get this burst of food availability in this habitat, and then you have to wait again. This feast and famine. A lot of animals, like lions, also do this. Migrants come through their habitats. Some predators will co-migrate with their prey.
Yeah, just follow them.
Just follow them along. There are certain populations of wolves that will follow caribou across the Arctic. Apparently, there are some spotted hyenas that will follow the African mammals as they migrate.
Which makes sense both on that's where the food's going, so go follow it. But also, if any weak or sick are going to get, pushed to their limit, this is the time.
Yes. Well, and I actually also thought it was interesting that the two examples that were mentioned when I was reading about it were wolves and hyenas. Because not only are those two species very adept hunters, they're also really good scavengers.
Yeah.
And so it seems like following the food is also a good way to get carcasses.
Yep.
Anything that falls down along the way. There are also migrations that are shaped by other migrations. This is super cool. There are crustaceans, copepods, in some parts of the world that overwinter down in the depths of the ocean, and then in the spring they migrate up to the surface. And that means in the spring there is an abundance of crustaceans in the water. North Atlantic right whales will migrate hundreds of kilometers from where they have their babies to where these copepods are coming up in the spring. These are two migrations that intersect so that one of them can eat the other one.
Yeah, so it's similar to a predator following the prey on their migration. You're doing it because your prey is there, but your migrations are not the same path.
Yes, you're meeting in the same place, and only one of you is happy about it. Horseshoe crab migrations take them onto the shores in certain parts of the Northeast here in North America, places like Delaware. And there are some birds that will use those beaches as a stopover on their migration. As their migration, they'll stop here for food because this is where another migration is happening, and we will eat them.
Man, and that's such a ships passing in the night timing of if one of you's early or late, that could really change that year for one of the groups. That's very cool.
One of the most famous examples of this kind of thing happening is, again, with salmon. Mm-hmm. Tons of animals migrate to where the salmon are migrating. There are sharks that will migrate to the base of the river where the salmon are migrating. Bald eagles, for example, will migrate up to the salmon area. Brown bears are known to travel tens of kilometers across the landscape to go to the rivers. And one paper noted that there are some populations of brown bears and certain birds will actually move across the landscape to hit sequential salmon migrations.
What?
The salmon coming up rivers at slightly different times, the bears and the birds will just go from one to the other and have a field day eating all the salmon.
It's like a bar crawl.
Yes, it's a salmon bar crawl across the rivers of North America or wherever.
Well, if someone doesn't make a movie of bears having a road trip where they make friends and you like gather people and have shenanigans along the way as they hit multiple salmon runs.
Euro Trip, but it's bears across the and Matt Damon can be in it again.
I want this movie. Please make this movie.
I also want to mention the one example of this thing that I found with reptiles.
Yee.
A study in 1996 looked at populations in Australia where there are, I think they were dusky rats that spend most of their time underground, but in the spring and when it gets rainy, they come up to the surface. This paper found that water pythons will travel up to 12 kilometers to go to the floodplains where the rats are coming up.
Wow.
Which is quite a trip for snakes.
Yes.
12 kilometers, that I would be uncomfortable going on a trip of 12 kilometers if I wasn't ready for it.
Yeah, on your belly the whole way.
On my belly the whole time, just crawling around.
That's because like snakes are not one you think of making big long distance movements, just because they are very mobile animals, but especially for not having legs, but they are not fast across the land.
Yeah,
so that is not what you typically think of for them.
Yeah.
This is a particularly cool version of it.
Yeah, and also it's very funny to me that the only examples that have come up in this conversation of reptile migrations are the ones with no legs and turtles.
Yep.
which feel like the last two that you would expect.
Yeah, well, because like I know crocodilians, there's been lots of accounts of them moving big distances.
Yeah, like saltwater crocs will go on long journeys in the water.
And sometimes that's because they got kicked out of a place or they are looking for a new place. A lot of relocated crocs are famous for traveling back to where they were relocated from.
Yep.
Where they get moved. It was like, you shouldn't be living here. We're going to take you someplace nice. And they go, no. I picked my spot.
I liked it there.
I liked that ladies' pool. But they don't do seasonal stuff. They just hunker down usually.
Right.
So it is very interesting which reptiles it does happen with.
Yeah, these are snakes going on a seasonal migration. It's not a very huge migration, but it's pretty big for snakes.
Yes. Cool.
So on the topic of discussing what species migrate and the variation in migration and how migration changes over time, how it evolves, how it affects ecosystems, a lot of papers, I came across a bunch of papers discussing the question of what features do animals evolve that seem to be important for migration. This seems to be a very difficult question to answer, in part because there are just so many different ways to be migratory. There are so many different animals that migrate. There are so many different versions of migration. But there are a handful of features that have been observed to be consistent, at least repeated, if not universal.
I'm very curious.
Some of these are features of the body shape, right? Wings in both birds and insects tend to be larger, longer, and narrower in migrating species, which makes tons of sense. Very similarly, but also very differently, the tails of migrating fish are often broader and have a more crescent shape, apparently, as I have seen. Again, that is helping you to move more efficiently long distance. Migratory animals are often larger than non-migratory animals, especially if you're comparing them to closely related species. And this is probably because, number one, it's easier to move farther if you're bigger. That you get more distance, you get more speed.
Yep.
It also means that you are maintaining certain aspects of your physiology more consistently. For example, another common feature among migrants, especially vertebrates, is that they will build up fat stores before the long journey. This is very consistent in birds, mammals, and so on. They will have extra reserves of fat to help provide fuel. There are many migrants that will use wind and water currents to help them move. This is something we see in a variety of different species, which also makes the salmon thing that much more preposterous.
Yes.
That you are against the current.
In the face of.
Well, and it is very much, I will fight the current so that my children don't have to.
Yes.
They can just ride it back to the sea, which does make me wonder about eels.
Yeah, we could learn something from salmon.
We could learn, yeah, the salmon and dragonflies, making things easy for the next generation. Migratory species also are repeatedly shown to have the ability to inhibit certain body functions.
Oh.
Particularly growth and feeding. A lot of migrants just won't eat for much of that journey. Whales are known to do this. A lot of birds are known to do this. And delayed reproduction. There are a lot of species that won't reproduce until they have migrated.
Yes.
That is something that they are effectively putting that on pause until they get where they're going. Mm-hmm. This is something we see in a lot of insects. We see this in a lot of birds.
Or like even if they get delayed or something, or it takes a little bit longer, they still, until they get to the spot where it's time to make babies, they will wait till then.
It's not time. On a similar note, a lot of migrants have also been shown, especially in things like birds and insects, to produce more offspring.
Oh.
They produce more eggs in the particular case of those too.
Okay, yeah.
And the last one that I'll note, which is perhaps the most famous shared feature of migrating animals, is the ways that they navigate. Mm-hmm. This is a massive question and focus of research on the topic of migrating species, is how do they know how to get from one place to the other? I will be mentioning it very briefly here at the end of this part of the discussion, putting your requests now for a navigation episode. A lot of animals are known to use landmarks that actually know parts of the landscape to determine that they're in the right place. Some animals are known to use smells. I think insects specifically have been observed to be recognizing certain odors. There are species that use the sun or the stars, which is very fun because that is also how we do it.
Yeah.
Like historically, that's how humans have navigated across the world.
Absolutely.
Following the stars. There are animals that will follow celestial objects. And the most famous version of this is magnetoreception. Mm-hmm. There are tons of species that seem to have the ability to detect the magnetic field of the Earth. As you move from place to place, the magnetic field will vary in the intensity of the field and also the shape of it. Mm-hmm. As you get farther north, for example, it is declined steeply toward the pole. When you're on the equator, the magnetic field is basically horizontal, and when you're on the pole, it is coming right in towards the center line of the Earth.
Yeah, if you think about that picture of an electromagnetic field of the Earth, it bows in and out from the poles.
The ability to detect these variations in the magnetic field and use them to navigate to the migratory spots has been detected to some degree in birds, fish, sea turtles, crustaceans, and more.
Yep.
This is a thing that animals have evolved to do over and over again.
Which it sounds like a sci-fi ability.
Yeah.
Of like Magneto type stuff. But a little bit of metal that can help you detect is not actually that complex. Like,
no.
We can make a compass by just rubbing a magnet against a piece of metal and putting it in something that lets it turn.
Rocks can tell us what direction the magnetic field is pointing.
So, like, it's not actually that crazy. It just feels very robotic.
Yeah. Well, especially because we don't do it.
No.
But it does.
It took us a long time to be able to invent that.
Yes. It does have a bit of that feeling we've talked about with other senses episodes, like eyes and ears. The magnetic field of the Earth is everywhere, and it does vary from place to place. So it would seem silly not to use it.
Yep.
Much the same way that, like, light. Yeah, vision makes all the sense in the world to be something that has evolved. There's light everywhere. Mm-hmm. And it's incredibly useful for navigating and getting around if you have an organ that can detect it. The magnetic field has a very similar feeling.
Well, I feel like the tracking the stars also can feel a little unbelievable when you first hear it, because star charts are by no means simple. Like,
right.
I've never attempted to learn it, but I've seen charting of how you track the night sky throughout the year, because it changes as our Earth tilts and as we get different stars in the sky at night. And using that is not a simple skill. Like,
No, I can't do it.
navigators were extremely skilled people in the early days of sailing. You were a master craftsperson if you could navigate by the stars. That was incredibly important. So the idea that it's like, these insects can recognize that. It's like, are you sure?
Right.
Are you sure? Because I worked real hard, and I don't know if I feel comfortable. It's kind of crazy that they have compasses and star chart navigation.
Yeah.
And that's the exact. It took us thousands of years to develop that.
Now, arguably, it took them millions of years.
Exactly.
To develop it. So it sort of balances out.
It's easy to forget because it's such a complicated invention that it makes sense. The stars are there for everyone that has eyes, and the magnetic sphere is everywhere, so might as well.
This is a fascinating topic that I have intentionally chosen not to take any further notes on because there's a lot to talk about in this episode. So that will be a different episode at some point, because if we talked about that now, we would not be able to get on to the next major section, which is migration in the fossil record. And the question, indeed, of can we tell if animals migrate? This is one of those questions that feels like a lot of topics we've talked about with the fossil record. Like the answer would just be no.
Yeah, like how in the world would you?
We can like infer some stuff.
Like fossils with their luggage?
The answer turns out to be a stronger affirmative than you would expect it to be. Not across the board, but there are actual direct evidences of migration in the fossil record, which is extremely cool.
Cool.
Stay tuned after the break for that. There are a bunch of animals in the fossil record that are very similar to animals today, and that makes it easy to point at them and say, yeah, that probably migrated.
Yeah.
Fossil birds, fossil whales, stuff like that. There are some animals in the fossil record for whom it is a big discussion. Let's talk about the animals for whom it is the biggest discussion, dinosaurs.
Yep.
There has been tons of ink spent on research discussions about the potential of ancient dinosaurs, the non-flying types, migrating. And part of this is because dinosaurs sure seem like animals that could have migrated.
Yeah.
They are often quite large. They have very efficient limb structure. We've talked about that. They have the legs directly under the body. They are also, a lot of them have good walking legs. Dinosaurs are interpreted, many of them, to have had high energy and activity levels, which means that they couldn't necessarily do what a crocodile does and just brumate over the winter. So for as long as we've been investigating the behavior of dinosaurs, there have been researchers looking for potential evidence of dinosaur migration.
Yeah, it's a situation of sure does make sense they would be doing it.
Yes.
Can we confirm that? There
are a few things that have been pointed at as potential supporting evidence. One is that there are a number of dinosaur groups, hadrosaurs, sauropods, ceratopsians, which are known from massive herd deposits. Like a lot of animals today, a massive herd will deplete local resources. So some have suggested that this could be an indicator that they had to migrate.
Yes.
If they were living in major herds. And it could be. Others have pointed that some dinosaur species have very wide ranges. Edmontosaurus regalis, to use one example I came across, is found across North America in an area of over 1,000 kilometers.
Whew.
The fossils from Alberta to Colorado. And some have said that sure seems like a long range to find this same species in. Although it is worth considering that it is very hard in the fossil record to say that those were all at the same time.
Yep.
That could be hundreds or thousands of years of difference. Also, a species in the fossil record is not the same as a species in modern times. Episode 98 for more on that. And other researchers have pointed to certain fossil deposits of dinosaurs that have different ratios of adults to juveniles.
Oh, that's a good point.
Which could, and we see that if you grabbed wildebeest at different parts of their migration, you would have a different ratio of adults to juveniles, because the juveniles are being born at one part, and by the time you get over here, they're partially grown up.
Yeah, or seals heading to the mating ground don't have any babies with them. Coming back from the mating ground, have babies with them.
Yes. And like we said before, adults and juveniles sometimes have different migratory patterns. And this kind of difference has been observed in the fossil record of other animals. For example, to move to mammals for a moment, there was a 2013 study I came across that looked at Ice Age fossils of blue antelope. This is an extinct species of antelope in South Africa. They examined fossils from across this wide area of southern Africa and noticed a trend that the farther east the fossils came from, the fewer young individuals there were.
Cool.
And as you went west, you found more and more young individuals, which suggested they were having their babies in the west and then migrating to the east, probably in like the dry season. So we can get this fossil evidence of migration habits. Now, Ice Age antelopes are going to have a much more complete and well-resolved fossil record than dinosaurs are going to have.
Yes.
Those...
with an Africa that was still shaped the way we recognize Africa today.
That research also noted that antelope species goes extinct at around the end of the Ice Age, and they pointed out that rising sea levels could have actually interrupted this migration route.
Oh, woo.
And that could have been at least one of the factors in what messed up this species and led to their extinction.
Oh, that's weird.
Yeah, well, and it's something that comes up a lot in this kind of research because it is very easy for changing environments to interrupt a migration pathway, which is really important for migratory species because it means even if this one habitat isn't being impacted, this other habitat is being affected by urbanization or climate change effects or deforestation or whatnot.
Or if we build up a highway straight across the path you would have been walking.
Yeah, absolutely. It's an issue with like noise in the ocean.
Yep.
Interrupting the navigation of sea animals.
That's why you have to turn your lights off at nesting beaches for sea turtles so they don't walk toward your porch.
Yeah. And with migrating animals, it's especially troubling to have the thought that if you build a highway here or if you cut down this forest, that could have devastating impacts on an ecosystem 1,000 miles north of here.
Yeah.
Because that's going to destroy this bird's nesting spot, and now there won't be birds returning back up there, and that's going to cause an imbalance in that ecosystem.
Which is that just if you live in a place and you suddenly stop seeing an animal you've been seeing, and you find out it's like, a dam got built.
They don't come here anymore.
Across country, but because of that...
someone built a dam 2,000 miles away, and now we don't get those insects here anymore.
Yep. Woof.
So there are a number of features of the dinosaur fossil record that have been pointed at as similar to things we see in some modern animals, especially big mammals, similar to some things we've seen in the fossil record of some big mammals. The question of dinosaur migration comes up especially around the topic of polar dinosaurs.
Yeah.
There are lots of dinosaur fossils that have been found in Alaska and northern Canada and Australia from times when those were polar habitats. And this includes like hadrosaurs and ankylosaurs and sauropods and stuff, which has led a bunch of researchers to question whether or not those animals could have stayed there all year round.
Yep.
Did they have to migrate? Because when winter came along, food reserves are going to go down, but also the light is going to go away.
Yep.
Did these dinosaurs have to migrate with the light from those habitats? Now, as far as I'm aware, there aren't any studies providing direct evidence that polar dinosaurs migrated south in and out of the poles, but there is some direct evidence that polar dinosaurs didn't migrate, which is a very fun. There we have evidence of not migration. Two examples that I'll mention that often come up. One is that the late Cretaceous dinosaur deposits of New Zealand have sauropods and ankylosaurs and a bunch of these big animals. And at that time, New Zealand was both polar and an island.
Yep.
Which means that those were not migrating animals. Those sauropods were not flying to the north.
All right, everybody, put on your water wings.
There was also a study from a few years ago, I believe we actually talked about this in the news, that identified, I think it was a fragment of a jawbone of a dromaeosaur, a small theropod dinosaur from Cretaceous Alaska, from a polar habitat, but that jawbone was a juvenile, which suggests that this was an animal that was born there.
Yep.
So they were nesting up in that area and likely living in those polar habitats. So there's been lots of discussion back and forth about in what context and where dinosaurs might have migrated. There have been a handful of studies that have provided what might be direct evidence of migratory habits in dinosaurs. I think all the ones that I'm going to mention, or many of them we have talked about in the news, because a lot of these are very recent.
Yes.
There was a study from 2021 that identified gastroliths from late Jurassic Wyoming. Gastroliths are stomach stones. A lot of birds, crocodilians will swallow stones that help grind up food in the gut. These were rocks found in this part, found in Wyoming, but which matched a rock formation from Wisconsin.
Oh, cool.
Which means they somehow traveled across the country. And the authors note there doesn't seem like to be like a conspicuous river system that would have done this. And these appear to be stomach stones. So they argue that this might have been sauropods, which are well known in that formation, that swallowed these stones and then migrated across the continent and then deposited these stones over here.
Which is very cool.
It's very cool. This is a little tricky because these stones are not found in a dinosaur.
Yep.
So they might be stomach stones. There have been other studies that have looked at isotopes. We talk about isotopes a bunch on the podcast. There are a number of elements that have different forms, and the ratio of the different forms of those elements will vary by habitat. One of the most famous elements used for this is strontium. There are multiple isotopes of strontium, and you can measure the ratio of the different isotopes, and that will be different depending on the local geology. It'll be different in different soils, and we can often match this to parts of the landscape.
Yes.
So you can measure the strontium in this animal and then go, all right, what nearby geologic region has that ratio of strontium based on the local geology? There was a 2020 study that looked at the strontium ratio in the enamel of the teeth of a hadrosaur from Alberta, and their strontium measurement matched a region that was 80 kilometers to the east.
Okay.
They also measured the strontium in other animals at the site, the fish, crocodilians, and theropods, and they didn't have variable strontium. Only the hadrosaur had variation, and one of those variations matched this site 80 kilometers to the east. Now, this makes sense that, the crocs aren't migrating, and
exactly.
that fish isn't taking a trip. So this seems to be good evidence that this hadrosaur took a long trip. This, of course, brings up the question of a migration versus just a home range.
Yeah.
The authors note that 80 kilometers is similar to the migration that is seen in some African elephants, but is also similar to the home range of some Asian elephants.
Yeah.
That this could be a migration, but it could also just be a long walk that this animal took over a long period of time.
Yeah, just a big home range for a big animal.
There was also a study from 2011 that looked at isotopes. These were oxygen isotopes, but it's the same basic idea. From Camarasaurus, a sauropod, in Wyoming and Utah. The fossils were found in basin wetland deposits, but there were isotopes found that matched the uplands up to 300 kilometers away from that site. This study also noted that over the course of the development of the teeth, the isotope ratio seemed to vary back and forth.
Oh.
Which could be an indication of repeated movements between uplands and lowlands.
Yeah.
Which could be seasonal, which could very well be migratory.
Cool.
So we for sure have evidence of dinosaurs taking long trips. Whether or not they were truly migratory in the sense that we think of it, We don't have a ton of direct evidence to support that, although we have a lot of intuitive evidence that is like, yeah, probably some of them were doing that.
Yeah.
It's so common among modern animals.
Basically every kind of animal today does it. For the group that was as diverse as they were during their age, it would be really weird
Yes.
if none of them were doing it.
Isotope research like that has also been used on other groups of animal life. To name a couple of examples, salmon, fossil salmon. There has been research that uses isotope variations of strontium because those ratios tend to vary between freshwater and seawater. Research has found variations in fossil salmon that indicates these were migratory salmon doing the freshwater to saltwater thing. There was even one study I found that pointed out that isotope variations, especially strontium, in ocean deposits across the last, few 100 million years are very well resolved.
Ooh.
So if you find a site, you can actually measure the isotope ratio reflecting the water conditions and narrow down where in time you are. Because we have that, like the magnetic field changes, it helps with stratigraphy. And there was one paper that pointed out that because of that, if we found fossil salmon in a freshwater environment, but they had picked up a strontium isotope ratio during their trips to the ocean, we could potentially date that freshwater environment because these are animals bringing signals from the ocean into the freshwater habitat.
That's really cool.
I don't know if that has actually been done. I saw a paper that suggested it as a possibility. I don't know if it's actually happened, but that is a very cool idea.
That's neat.
The other group of animals, and perhaps the most famous group of animals, at least the first that come to my mind, for which isotope studies have been used to determine their migration, is mammoths.
Mm-hmm.
This has come up a couple times in the podcast. A variety of studies have examined isotope ratios in the tusks of mammoths, and this is really cool because the tusks grow over the course of the life of the elephant and leave layers kind of like tree rings. So research will take a section of the tusk and measure the isotope ratios across the different growth segments of the tusk to see how they varied over the lifetime of that mammoth, and then match up those isotope ratios with different habitats in the region. There was a 2021 study that I think we talked about on the podcast that looked at the tusk of a single mammoth and was able to identify it spent its early years in this part of Alaska, then started moving more widely as a teenager and started taking longer trips. There was a study that we just talked about a couple episodes ago that did the same thing with a single mammoth, also from Alaska, born in the Yukon, grew up there, and then as a teenager traveled around 1,000 kilometers over just a few years and ended up in Alaska.
Which is really cool.
Where we can get direct evidence of not only that these animals moved, but where they moved and how far they moved and when during their life they started moving. And those are very similar patterns to what we see in modern elephants.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The ability to be able to track, like, getting evidence that makes a suggestion for a species is awesome, but also being able to track a single individual's lifestyle cycle down to the detail like that is very pleasing.
It is so cool.
That's you got the autobiography of that mammoth, basically.
And this is where we will take a brief detour to talk about a thing that I said we weren't going to talk about. Isotope studies are also extremely useful for tracking the movement of humans.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
These same kinds of studies have been used at historic and archaeological sites on human remains. Because we found a person here, this is where that person died, and then isotopes can help us identify where they might have come from. There was a paper that I read recently, I actually wrote a press release for this paper, that was an individual who died in Denmark, was found at a site in Denmark, and isotopes showed that this person spent their early years in an area farther north near the coast, and their DNA showed that they were closely related to people farther north in the Scandinavian area, and the deposits in the teeth showed that in their early life, they were eating coastal foods. And then in their later life, they were eating more farming type foods.
Cool.
So we were able to look at this person and go, yeah, this person was born here, lived there for 10 years or so, then moved. Now, why that person moved is a separate question. And now we get into, we think of migration, whether in wildlife or immigration in people, as often being a voluntary thing. But of course,
yes.
Now once we get into human history, there's a whole bunch of political science to get into. But isotope studies like this, there's been tons of studies like that are able to go, yeah, this person here was born far away, grew up far away, and then moved here for some reason later in life, which is really useful for studying the history of social changes or economic things. Or there'll be studies where, yeah, this person grew up, and then when they reached marrying age, they moved. Things like that, those sort of cultural things in human archaeology.
Which, once again, so cool we can get that much detail.
Very cool. I should note here, isotope studies are also used in modern migration studies. I've seen this come up with salmon, where researchers will look at the bones of salmon captured out at sea and then measure their isotopes to determine where they were born.
Yes.
And the opposite, capturing salmon in rivers to then determine where is their marine feeding ground. And this is really helpful for establishing conservation efforts, understanding where are we fishing. When we fish here in the sea, which river populations are we depleting?
Yes.
Where is this taking the salmon from?
Exactly.
One more example that I want to give about fossil evidence for migration. I left it over here at the end because it didn't fit neatly into my structure of the rest of this discussion. This was a 2000 study, a study from the year 2000, that looked at an assemblage of fossils of Lepidoptera, that is, butterflies and moths, from Denmark, another Denmark study, at the Paleocene-Eocene boundary 55 million years ago. This deposit has an incredibly high abundance of moth/butterfly fossils, over 1,000 specimens of one species.
Wow.
Plus several hundred specimens of several other species. Massive deposit of these bugs. The deposit is marine sediment. Ocean sediment in the North Sea. And that's not where they were living.
Nope.
So these authors proposed that this seems to be evidence of a mass migration. They are dying while moving. And they note that several modern species of moths and butterflies migrate over the North Sea.
Yep.
This is a thing we see in modern animals. This seems to be evident, the only example that I found at least, of evidence of a fossil insect migration.
That's very cool.
It's super cool. As I said before, the study of fossil migration is one of those great examples of a question that you'd think we would have no answers for. And it turns out we actually have a lot of different answers for.
Well, and it's interesting the ways we have to get at them, because we could easily determine, would you probably be capable of this? Your limbs are efficient for walking. You're as big as animals that we see doing migrations today. You have feeding habits or lifestyles indications that are similar to migrating animals. So very easy to determine, you should probably have been able to achieve migrations, but those typical lines of evidence won't help with, were you traveling long distance?
Right.
And so we have to start getting into other techniques and other points of view. And we've talked about isotopes before many a time. This is a very interesting and creative way to use those to indicate whether or not you at least traveled a great distance.
Yes.
And then potentially, if you were doing it somewhat regularly.
Yeah. It's very interesting to ponder the question of migrations in the past, because it's so common and widespread in the world today that it seems very reasonable to think that there has probably been migration as long as there have been animals.
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm sure Cambrian trilobites were things that lived all the way back then were migrating between different habitats at times.
Like, even if they've changed or the intensity of them have shifted, we've had summer and winter since Earth started spinning around the sun.
Yep, that's how the Earth works.
So that's been there, and life in the ocean, even if we're just going with the night-day cycle, there's no reason they shouldn't have had both reason and capability to migrate the way we see stuff in the ocean doing it today, all the way back to the first organisms moving around.
Yes, it is a fascinating topic. We could have done the whole episode just on different modern day migration paths. Super cool. Very excited to get to touch on it in the fossil record. We are not quite done talking about migration because we have patron questions.
Yes.
We actually have 2 patron questions this episode because the first one is just an extension of this discussion. One of the benefits that our patrons can get from supporting us on Patreon is the ability to submit questions that we will answer on the podcast. Will, what is our first patron question?
Our first question is from Jackie, who says, in the sleep episode, we wondered about pterosaurs sleeping with half their brain while flying, to which Jackie thought, sure, if they migrated, they would almost have to, but do we actually know if pterosaurs migrated? What evidence do we have other than the fact that a bunch were big enough to do it?
This is a great question, and if anybody was wondering why I didn't bring up pterosaurs earlier, this is why, because this question was coming up. Pterosaurs, the flying reptiles of the Mesozoic, your pteranodons and pterodactyls and such. Pterosaurs are in a similar situation to dinosaurs in the regards to migration. It seems like they should have been able to migrate.
Yeah.
That they can fly.
Yes.
Birds migrate, insects migrate, bats migrate. Anything that flies today, there are migrating examples of it.
Yes, indeed.
So they certainly could migrate. A lot of discussions of migrating pterosaurs tend to revolve around their size.
Yeah.
Because there have been some studies that have looked at the biggest one, your Quetzalcoatlus-sized pterosaurs, to ask how long could you fly?
Yeah.
How far could you go in one flight? And there have been studies that have estimated that they would have been, because of their size, the efficiency of their soaring capability, the speed they would move at because of being so big, that hypothetically some pterosaurs might have been capable of flying thousands or even tens of thousands of miles in a flight. Just crossing continents and oceans in one go.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this has been, discussed back and forth, and I think that it's important to note that's not necessary to migrate.
Mm-mm.
You don't have to be able to do that in order to migrate, obviously. But if they could do that, then that does raise the possibility. Were you doing something that Arctic Terns today would say, yeah, that's... Yeah. Was it like monthly?
Yes, exactly.
Just back and forth between the poles. To my knowledge, there is no direct evidence supporting pterosaur migrations definitively. There are a number of bone beds of pterosaurs that have been interpreted as colonial nesting sites, which is something we do see in a lot of migratory birds, although that doesn't necessarily mean that they were migratory. There are also a number of species that are known from skewed age assemblages. Mm-hmm. An assemblage with mostly adults and not a lot of young, or mostly young with not a lot of adults. And then there are some that have a good mixture of both, which could indicate that some species are breeding in one area and then living in another area, or that adults and juveniles have different migratory habits like we see in some birds. I don't know of any isotope studies or anything like that has been done in pterosaurs.
Yeah.
So, did pterosaurs migrate? I mean, if you're asking me for my scientific opinion, yeah, probably.
Yeah.
I would be shocked if there weren't tons of migrating species of pterosaurs.
Why in the world wouldn't you?
Yeah.
It just makes so much... All the reasons of you can fly, and it's super beneficial when you have the most efficient travel to travel to the best areas.
Well, and it's also not... Migration isn't just a thing you do because you have to do it. Migrating species are able to access resources, like we were saying before. If you can migrate, you can bounce between high productivity environments.
Yeah.
If you can't migrate, you're stuck in one place, whatever happens there.
Well, it's like the rich families who have a winter home and a summer home. It's if you
Yes.
can,
Then it's great.
why wouldn't you?
Absolutely. Thank you, Jackie, for that question. The answer is,
Yeah.
but probably.
Yes.
What is our second patron question?
Our second question is from Clara. How would ecosystems be different if Earth had no seasons? That is, if the planet's axis of rotation were perpendicular to the orbit around the sun. Equatorial ecosystems are like this, but they're influenced by the surrounding seasonal ecosystems, and they're all tropical, so it's not a great model, I think.
This is a very interesting question and very applicable to this discussion. So, the Earth is tilted on its axis, which means that while it spins and while it goes around the sun, different places get different amounts of direct sunlight at different times of the year, hence winter and summer. So if the axis was perfectly up and down, perpendicular to the orbit around the sun, there wouldn't be summer and winter.
The equator would always be the closest point to the sun.
Yes. This would mean, this would do a lot of things to the Earth. It would mean that environments all around the world were remarkably stable.
Yes.
The equatorial ecosystems, tropical environments would always be warm. Basically, it would always be summer at the equator, and it would always be winter at the poles, and it would always be spring and autumn in the temperate zones, in the mid-latitudes.
Pretty much.
This would change a lot of ecosystem structures for sure.
Majorly.
It would make the polar latitudes a lot less habitable, because now it's winter all the time up there, and you can't hibernate forever.
Yes.
And if you're migratory, that just means you never go back.
Yeah. So they're like the very top and bottom of the globe might just be inhospitable. Like that there's just a center at the top and bottom that just never gets. I don't know if they would get the full night, but if it would just be extremely like sunset at best.
Yeah.
Because
it'd be very indirect sunlight.
Yeah, you'd never be tilted away, which is when they get the full nighttime, the 24-hour nights that they get, but you would never ever get a day of sun.
Yes. Absolutely. I actually reached out to Allie to ask for a plant perspective on this, and one note that she made was that if there were plants living in higher latitudes, they would have to be adapted for indirect sunlight.
Yes.
They'd have to have bigger leaves or something to collect more sunlight where it's not coming in directly. They're living in perpetual sunset.
Yes.
On the note of this episode with migrations, I did look this. I went to the internet and I was like, what else? What has been talked about this? And I've seen a number of places that will suggest that there wouldn't be migrations. And for sure there wouldn't be seasonal migrations. You wouldn't have winter, summer. Although you could still get migrations for if this area is better for breeding and this area is better for eating. So it wouldn't necessarily mean no migrations, but it might mean a lot fewer migrations.
And they might not be synced up with the year that we see.
Yeah.
The same way that we see a lot of them nowadays. Like, I wonder if we'd see a lot of animals that are not on a yearly cycle.
Yeah, and that was the other thing that I thought, because in theory, you could now just breed whenever.
Yeah.
Now, there may be other systems that are at play. One thing that I saw made the point that, and I think we've talked about, this has come up with studies of past Earth continental arrangements and such, that if it was really hot at the equator and really cold at the poles, you'd have more intense climate systems. So, one place pointed out that the mid-latitudes might be very stormy.
Yeah.
Because you're getting that interaction of cold and warm air currents or ocean currents.
And those probably will end up forming some cycles and patterns.
Yeah,
just because energy can't just sit. It's going to fluctuate, and there's going to be times where there's more storms and less storms. Whether that's just the fact that once the storms storm themselves out, that energy has dissipated and it takes a little while for it to build back up.
Yes. But, yeah, there wouldn't be seasonal cycles. I also asked Allie, do plants, because as Clara points out, the equator is like this today. There aren't seasons, like winter, summer seasons in the equator. There are often wet and dry seasons
Yes.
in the tropics.
Which is due to the movement of weather across the globe.
Yes, which is affected by the seasons,
Yep.
so as Clara points out. But equatorial environments don't have winter-summer seasons. And I confirmed with Allie, tropical plants fruit all year round.
Yep.
There isn't a growing season like we think of here in sort of temperate latitudes. So plants and animals, in theory, other aspects being equal, could just breed and reproduce whenever is convenient for them. So you wouldn't get that sort of syncing up like we see. There wouldn't be a spring
Yes.
and a winter die-off like we think of.
And so, like, even at the upper, the mid latitudes where it's, just more spring to autumn and less, potentially ideal and tropical for plant growth, they still could be doing whatever they're doing there all year round consistently. I wonder if we would see more animals that are also breeding that way, because there's animals that breed that way. Like, not all animals have a breeding season. Lots of rodents just have babies whenever they are able.
Yes.
When they are fed well enough to have babies, they will make more rodents. Would we see a lot more animals just living that way? To where there's not really a benefit to trying to, unless it's just to sync up for like predatory reasons or something.
Right.
You don't have to worry about the food because the food's basically going to be the same.
I also feel like it would mean certain biomes could only exist in some parts, some latitude. Like you probably couldn't have forests particularly far up toward the up or down toward the poles,
because they won't have that growing season.
Yeah, and they're not going to get enough light. And is that going to then affect what animals live there? It's a very interesting hypothetical.
Yeah, will we just have a gradient as with dense life around the middle and then getting thinner and thinner as you move to the top and bottom?
Probably.
Yeah. One thing that I think is worth mentioning is there would be some potential seasonality due to the fact that Earth's orbit is not perfectly circular around the sun.
Yes.
Orbits are elliptical. They are not a perfect round orbit. So there are times where we are a little bit farther and the orbit does shift. So, and the sun also goes through its intensity cycles.
Yes. So there are other cycles besides just those caused by the tilt.
Yeah. So I wonder if like those, all these together often called fall into the Milankovitch cycles that you'll hear people talk about. And I wonder if those would play a much heavier role.
Yeah.
Because now that, even though it's what we would consider a slight difference compared to winter and summer, it is now the only difference throughout the year or the decade.
Yes. Yeah, the orbital change is called eccentricity. And if the point in the orbit when we are closest to the sun is also when we are tilted at the sun, one way or the other, then summers are more intense.
Exactly.
And then winters are more intense. One other thing that I want to mention is when I looked this up, there was a bunch of articles and videos that I found that were like, what if there were no seasons? And the main sort of thrust of their answer was all humans would die, or at the very least, it would be very bad for humans. And in some, humans would never have made it to where we are now. And the two of the common reasons I saw cited for this are, one, winter is very important for ridding environments of parasites and diseases.
Very true.
That will be prevalent all year round if it's a perpetual summer at the equator. And two, many of the plants that we grow, a lot of our crop plants, require seasonal changes. That a lot of our plants, if there isn't a winter, they won't survive because they need that. Therefore, our crop plants wouldn't exist and we would never have made it to where we are technologically. And that I do not agree with. That I think is a good answer to what if the Earth suddenly lost its seasons tomorrow?
Yes, thank you. If we suddenly, if some interdimensional being
if
came
Galactus
through,
sneezed on us,
came
Earth
through and went,
straightened
"Ooh,
out.
let me tilt. One of your planets is crooked.
How long has it been like
Sorry,
this?
son."
And they tilt it, and then they go, "Oh, Uranus!" And then they go across the solar system and forget about us.
If that suddenly happened, it would be devastating. Like whole communities would be shaken apart.
But if that's just how the Earth was, then there wouldn't be plants that required a seasonal cycle.
No, nothing
would have evolved that way.
Everything would grow normally in this situation.
And we probably also, animal and plant life would have evolved to deal with the perpetual presence of parasites and pathogens in the warmer areas.
Yep. Which I think is a more telling aspect of those comments is how prevalent seasons are in life and our way of thinking about the Earth.
And also how high latitude centric.
Yep.
Because that there are people and communities that live in the tropics.
Tons of humans around the equator.
Isn't winter, and where there isn't that reprieve from tropical diseases and parasites.
Yep, I had that thought as well. But it's like, well, our crops. I'm like, well, your crops.
Your crops, yeah. our crops, yes. Here in the United States, we would have a hard time.
Human crops is a wider variety.
Very cool question. I'm sure we could go on.
Oh, yeah.
This is a very fun discussion. Listeners, if you have thoughts about what would happen if we had no seasons, feel free to plop them in comments. You can comment on YouTube. You can join the Discord for conversations with the other listeners. Also, if you have favorite migrations or migration anecdotes and stuff that you want to share that we didn't mention because there are a million incredible examples, and I'm so sorry I could only pick so many. Be sure to check out the blog on our website, link in the episode description, because we will have a blog post with links and photos and things like that. Don't forget that the first episode of Spotlight 2024 is officially out. We chatted with Adele from Pals and Paleo. We had a great time. Go check it out and stay tuned for more Spotlight 2024 episodes. Thanks again to all the people who requested this episode topic. We had a ton of fun. Thanks again to all of our patrons who support us, new patrons and old patrons. Special thanks to our top tier patrons, Sarah May, Danielle the Bug Lover, Robert Mart, and Melissa Barksdale. Thank you for your amazing support. We release episodes on a cycle.
Yes.
They come and they go.
Yep.
You could plan your road trips around our fortnightly episode release cycle. 2 weeks from now, 2 weeks from the release of this episode, there will be another episode.
Oh man, are the listeners like the predators that follow along?
Are they co-migrating?
Are they co-migrating with the podcast to feed off?
Are there any listeners that plan their trips and such around the release of our podcast?
Oh, I actually really want to like.
In which case, there's the fortnightly migration cycle.
Yeah. Or for you, commute probably is
commuting. Sure.
Yeah.
Yep. When you fly out to sea to forage for your nest, and then you come back. All right, let's move on out of here.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to the Common Descent podcast. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, and check our WordPress blog for pictures and links after each episode. Huge thanks to our patrons whose support helps keep this podcast running and who get access to bonus goodies on Patreon. The song you're hearing is called On the Origin of Species by Protodome, which we found at ocremix.org. Thanks again for listening. We hope you'll join us next time.